Okay, we're going to get into Unit 2 now, and this is your second video presentation to be listening to and getting notes down from, and to be helping you for your test and also for your project that you're going to be doing that we are going to be going over in class, or actually have gone over in class. What we're going to get into with this video presentation is we're going to talk about some of the different types of research that a social psychologist would get into in dealing with when they're looking at trying to take a research topic and to get the information that they need to be able to prove their theories. So what we're going to look at first is experimental research. And on that one, what an experiment is basically is where an investigator manipulates a variable and then observes the effects that this has on the other variables to determine a cause-effect relationship. Now, in your book, there is on page 56 a really good example of experimental research, and it's dealing with violence and children and watching movies and video games and those kinds of things, and do they, by watching those, translate over into actual physical violence by the kids once they get out in the public. And so basically this research project, what it did is they went in and they manipulated two of the independent variables, which was dealing with the children watching violent films or not watching violent films. And then based upon that, they would take the kids and they would go out into the playground and those kind of things and watch them, observe them, by seeing how aggressive these children were and how violent they were acting towards each other then, based upon what had happened to them previous to that. Now, their behaviors of their aggression that the children were showing, that would be the dependent variable. Okay? And on the PowerPoint there, again, what the independent variable is the event that the experimenter varies or manipulates in order to see the impact it has on the other variable, which in this case is the dependent variable, which is the variable that is being affected by manipulation of the independent. So in this case, the two independent variables was dealing with the films. One was a violent film that the kids were watching, a lot of aggression, a lot of hostility, those kinds of things. And then the other film that was being shown to the kids was a much more peaceful and nonviolent. And then they would go watch the kids play and see whether or not the kids who watched the violent film was much more aggressive acting. And the results of the study show that they were. So they would be able to show from this study then that violent movies or violent shows, those kinds of things, do have an effect on the behavior of a child then. When you're also looking at some other variables though, that you have to be careful about, and one of those is once exposed to the independent variable, the reaction must be observed carefully to determine whether the predicted results of the study hold. Now, there are two other types of variables that you have to watch out for. And one of these is dealing with the extraneous variable, and basically the extraneous variable is the other types of factors that could come into play when you're making the study. So in this case, for that research there on page 56, the example one, some of the things that were not looked at was maybe the age of the children, and maybe they had not taken into account the fact that the older children who had watched a violent movie might be the ones acting out more, or maybe acting out less than the younger children who had watched. Another thing could have been cultural differences, social economic factors could play into it. There was a lot of other possibilities as to what would cause or why some of the children were much more violent than other children, rather than just watching the video. It could be that those children, that are acting out aggressively come from homes where there's a lot of physical violence or physical activity, and so that could cause it too. So those are called extraneous variables. Sometimes they do play a factor into that. Then you also have what's called confounding variables, and these are basically, confounding variables are dealing with different types of other factors that could link together with the other variables and could cause a different kind of an effect. Okay, the slide 2 then is looking at the different types of experimental research. And basically there are two types. There's field experiment, and then there is the laboratory. Field experiment would be the example that we've been talking about. That is the Jacques-Philippe Lyons, I think that is the name of the psychologist there, who did the study about the kids and the violence with the movies. That was a field experiment. Basically, he had them out in the open where they were being observed to see what kind of behaviors that they were reacting to from watching the movies then. Now, field experiments are basically in a natural setting with the participants not knowing that they're being observed, not knowing they're being watched. They're just participating in the experiment with very limited knowledge of that. Because of that, the advantage of a field experiment is it's very much less suspicious of what they're doing, and so therefore the respondents or the participants are going to be much more spontaneous in their reactions, and that is very good for an experimenter who is looking for that kind of reaction. They don't want, like in a laboratory setting where they already know that they're being observed and watched, and a lot of times that's going to hinder what the true feelings are of the participants. So that's why a field study would be much better in this case. It also gives the study a lot more external validity. Now, external validity is findings that generalize to people beyond those of the study. And external validity is going to look at the outside factors, such things as their emotional behavior and their natural tendencies to be able to react to certain things. And in this case, field studies do a much better job of that. The drawbacks of field studies, though, is they're less control of the variables and precisely measuring the dependent variable itself. For example, with the kids, you might see, some of the kids playing around the playground and stuff and not notice that they're acting out violently. And that's because some of the kids who might be doing this may not be doing it on the field playground. They may actually, maybe when they're in the bathroom, they maybe start bullying or shoving or pushing or hitting other kids when it's outside of the realm of the observers watching. So that's one of the drawbacks of field studies, is that it's not really a controlled environment, so therefore you sometimes miss things that you would be looking at. Now, laboratory experiments is the result in the opposite effect. That is where there's a lot more internal validity with the factor that things are controlled. Things are being able to be manipulated and a lot more handle on it. The problem with laboratory, though, is oftentimes then, because of that, there's not going to be a natural tendency for the participants to be able to act out normally. An example of a laboratory experiment that you can read again in your book would be really good on page 57. It goes through another example of a experiment, and I think that'd be a really good one to read because I think there's going to be some questions on your test over that too. One of the ways to get around a lot of the confounding variables and other problems when it comes to experiments is using random assignment. This allows the experimenter to remove the possibility of bias or unequal advantage of one group over the other, and that can help eliminate some of those discrepancies that I talked about earlier when it comes to that. Okay, we've already talked about one of the examples that I have up here on this slide, and that was dealing with the violent actions when aggressiveness of children and violent video games. There's lots and lots of studies on this, and again, a lot of them are showing a very strong, in some cases, cause and effect, that they could say that video games and violent movies do have a very serious effect on children's behavior and aggressions up to a certain age. Once that child gets past a certain age, then the tendencies tend to fall off a little bit. But there's a lot of experiments on that one. Another one that I was going to bring up on an example of experimental research had to do with a study that was done in the University of Minnesota. And it was kind of a fascinating study. They took 76 male students. And what they told them they were going to do is they were going to have phone conversations with female students on the other end. And basically what they were supposed to be doing is talking to them about general things, get to know you type of material, those kinds of things like that. And the whole idea was some of the male students were given pictures of what they thought the respondent on the other side of the phone was going to look like. And some of the pictures showed very attractive, beautiful young women, and some of the pictures showed women who are a little more obese, not quite as pretty in some cases, those kinds of things. And what they found is when they were doing recorded times of conversations, the male students who had looked at who thought they were talking to somebody whose picture was very pretty would spend more time, was more engaged into the conversation, much more emotionally connected into the conversation than they were with conversations of people that they thought were not as good looking or they were bigger, larger type of individuals. They did this again with female students, and they noticed that that trend was not nearly as prevalent. So it was an interesting type of an experiment being done on dealing with the idea of what's known as a Cinderella effect, how people's looks can have a huge impact on how people are treated then. The third one is dealing with this concept of the idea of, instead of violence causing aggression, what about peaceful, soft, serenity type music or messages? Would those, if they have been prolonged enough into a person, would they change a person's behavior? And so they had two groups listening to this type of music. One type of music was the very low, sensual type of messages and different types of music that was being played for that, very romantic music or sensual music and that. And then the other group was just listening to neutral music. At the end of the activities they were doing, they had asked each of the participants to leave a donation for charity. And what they found in the study, which they had hypothesized pretty accurately, was that those that had listened to the sensual, calm, very relaxing, romantic music had left almost twice as much money for charity as did the other one. So again, it shows that there's a lot of manipulation that goes on in our subconscious minds that causes us to change our behaviors or to do different behaviors then. So these are three examples of different types of experimental research. Okay, that ends this first slide of notes, and then we're going to get into the next slide notes, which is dealing with the other type of research. Okay, the second type of research that is done by social psychologists is dealing with what's known as correlational research or descriptive research. Either one of those terms can fit pretty well. Basically what it is sometimes psychologists are not able to do experiments, either because they cannot control the variables of the independent variable in order to show the manipulation upon the dependent, or because of the fact of the subject matter that they're studying is to the fact that using an experiment would be dangerous, would be harmful, would be something that you would not want to do. So because of that then, they would use a different type of research method, which is known as descriptive or correlational research, which allows the psychologist to look at and to predict the behaviors that they're going to try to assume is going to happen. The problem is they cannot come up with and say, based upon the study now, that they can have a direct effective cause like you can with experimental studies. Experimental studies are really good for cause and effect relationships. Correlational studies do not do that. They can only help in the prediction of behavior and being able to show that there is a correlation or a connection between the two things that they're being studied, but it doesn't mean that there is a direct cause-effect relationship. So the researchers cannot manipulate variables, and because of that, they cannot determine that cause-effect relationship. They can only determine the link of the variables, which is being able to show that there is a correlation to that. Okay, so how this works in a correlation study basically is, again, you have a study being done. For example, just a real quick example of a correlational study that was done back in 2008 during the presidential election race between John McCain and Barack Obama. There was a study that was done because John McCain had a dog and Barack Obama did not. And so what this group did is they did a study to see, the dog owners, which one they favored more, McCain or Obama. And they found the dog owners supported McCain almost 2-to-1 over Obama. And, here again, you can't directly say that those people are supporting John McCain because there's not a cause-effect relationship there. They can't say that they're supporting him because he has a dog, and Obama